So it kind of sounds, I don't know if any of you are SCTV fans, but do you remember the Sammy Maudlin show? Maybe this is starting to feel a bit like that. So I'm one of the, I don't know if I'm Bobby Bittman or what, but we'll leave it there. So I'm absolutely honored to be speaking with you today. I'm not sure if I'm brave so much as pathologically curious, but it's something that has informed a lot of what I do. And I'm going to sort of throw a few challenges, a few sort of provocative, I don't know, I guess I'm going to sort of hit you across the face with a glove a little bit about your creative lives in the city, and maybe give you a few case studies that may sort of lead you to think about your presence and your work in a new way. So what, let's see, where are we here? Why am I here? I have a pretty sort of storied past, I guess. I started my creative life training with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet School for many years, training to be a dancer, which is a really interesting sort of way to sort of understand the world and your body and your place in it. But really, what has informed a lot of my work is, and my thinking is a path of writing. I attended journalism school, studied literature, and found that writing was a way that I could understand the world. I really started to kind of question. I worked in traditional journalism. I was a culture and arts critic for the Ottawa Citizen as a contract writer. I worked for CBC, for National Public Radio in the States, reviewing dance, reviewing music, reviewing theater, thinking about contemporary culture, architecture. And it was a really exciting time for me to be able to reflect and think about culture and write about it and reflect on it in a critical way. But I started to feel, what was the purpose? Where was I going next with that? How was I going to sort of move beyond simply reflecting and documenting what was happening creatively? Basically, some graduate studies in Canadian cultural studies sort of started to anchor me in a more political kind of response to the world, right in front of my face. And do you know what? I'm really nervous today. I love public speaking, and I'm super nervous. So I'm just going to say that once and get it out of the way. It's done. It's out there. I think it's like talking in front of your family or your friends. So really, the transformation after sort of grad school was really starting to think about kind of a politicized creative practice. So thinking about arts and culture in the service of public good. And my background in journalism led me to start working in strategic communications. And one of the most seminal sort of experiences in my working life was working here in Vancouver with an organization called Impacts, which is the Institute for Media Policy and Civil Society. Sadly, it was shuttered in 2007. But that was 5 years of working with communities. We were a not-for-profit that served not-for-profits across Canada and the world in really helping people working on social justice, community building, environmental justice, helping them become better communicators and understand that communication, that really transforming the world, you had to not only speak to the choir and the people that you knew, but also to really move out there and use the latest sort of communications technologies to do that. So some examples of that were campaigns we worked on called Extinction Sucks with the BC Species at Risk group. So we were trying to get protect endangered species in BC and Canada. Worked on campaigns to sort of get physicians thinking about global disarmament. Campaigns that looked at trying to educate people about salmon aquaculture and its role in preserving wild salmon stocks, working with immigrant integration groups, trying to get them thinking about how they could make everyone in Canada understand the role that immigrants and newcomers play in society. So it's a really interesting, powerful time. I went on to work for for-profit agencies in branding, and one in particular in visioning and storytelling. Had a very interesting stint there. And for those of you who know that, what they started to do was to think about narrative storytelling as ways of really anchoring at a limbic brain, reptile brain level, getting people to make strong emotional connections with ideas, with products, with transformational projects. Going out on my own was really interesting, and I had an opportunity to really start seeing that ethical companies, social entrepreneurs were really leading the charge, and this kind of broth of creativity, social activism, communications campaigning, convening, facilitating. A lot of the work that I did was about bringing sometimes fractious groups together who are working in coalition and finding ways to get them to anchor themselves in common purpose or common vision. This created sort of a broth for me. So you can see that I sort of followed the magpie. I've followed the shiny, strategic and innovative things that really fed me. So that's sort of where I come from. And it's an interesting, sometimes that's been challenging because when people ask me what I do, it's always a bit of a longer conversation, so I usually joke, or as my friends who are here know, I usually give a high kick or something that sort of interpretive dance translates into that, what it is that I do. So, but I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about the city, because all this work, a lot of this focused on global change, global transformations, and certainly when I was working on these large campaigns, a lot of this was about globalization. And as we've seen, really, the challenges for Vancouver and at the local level are really where transformational change is happening. We see that we are now in this urban age, and we are seeing this mass migration to cities. By 2050, 80%, maybe 90% of the world's populations will live in cities. That change is happening, transformational change is happening at a civic level. And so many of my friends who've worked in some of these larger movements are now really focusing their activities on the city, and the city that they live in. And this is the city that I live in, and this is the city that I've chosen. My t-shirt, I live in Strathcona. My t-shirt is a fundraiser for a food program at the Strathcona School, so if you'd like one, they're available at the Strathcona Community Centre for $15. But I focus my activities on my community, on my block, on the polis, on this sort of city where I am. And I find it disorienting living here, because we are really one of the world's great petri dishes for civic innovation. Planners from around the world look to us and say, the Vancouver model, Vancouverism, the Vancouver miracle. What is it that's happening here? The density, the commitment to sustainability, the planning that's happened, the harmony, the quality of life here is really unbelievable. And yet, there is incredible lack of social cohesion, I would say. There is a huge affordability gap. There's income gaps that are so shocking on a daily basis to me that in some ways they're highly disempowering. And I think too there's a culture here where it's incredibly generative, it's incredibly creative. There's so many people here doing unbelievable things, both for the city and in their own creative realms. It's generative, we're making new, and yet we are quite an amnesiac city too, because we're not building on the things that have come before. And I would say there is not enough collaboration in creative communities and all sorts of communities, that we're all sort of fighting for our peace. It can be tough living here, and you're making your own way. And so I see that people need to rethink or recontextualize their relationship to the city in terms of its health as a city, in terms of what makes it robust. Creative cities there's been a lot of discussion about what a creative city is. We are not simply the sexy Salesforce for Vancouver because it's creative and lots of creatives work here. Our work is also to figure out how we co-create our lives in the city and co-create our working lives in this city. And so what kind of contributions are we making to that? So what do you think? Boring? Getting there? And I would say, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but I think that the quality of civic engagement, the quality of the way people participate in that very sort of, I think, very classic way of understanding how we work with the city is not great. I think that the city is doing tremendous things. I think it has great sort of policy agendas, but in terms of how people are really interacting with the civic government or with the city and how it's built and how it's defined, I would say there are not enough people doing it, and the quality of those interactions are ultimately dissatisfying. So I want to talk a little bit about some trends that I think are kind of leading us to a new practice, and I'm going to put a few ideas in front of you about a possible sort of new way to understand your creative lives in terms of improving the city. So I think that there's some really interesting moment in terms of the drive to transparency. I think that this idea of open source or smart cities, so using technologies, apps, so that citizens can actually communicate in real time with their governments, with their communities, open data, which is making lots of information about the city that the city generates available to people. And I think that that's a really interesting moment. A lot of people are saying that the most creative things that are happening in terms of civic engagement are very much driven by technology now. What is the new killer app? What is the new thing that's going to open up our relationships and get more people participating? I think that we need to think about the social technologies, and I am really excited about some of the new technologies that are happening in terms of making cities more open, more responsive between citizen and between this policymakers. But I want to see what are the social technologies, and I think that the people who are in this room have the ability. I mean, we see with this platform, this is one of the most interesting ways to re-engineer your city is convening. Perhaps convening is a new killer app. We have amazing assets in this city in terms of bringing people together. We have people in media. We have people who are bringing salons together. We have people who are doing unbelievable thinking about how the city works. I would like to challenge us to start thinking about how we are going to create creative projects or creative enterprises or activities that have a direct impact on how open our cities are, how responsive, and the quality of democracy. So I'll tell you more about what I mean. I was going to get a little theoretical there, but I'm going to mix it up a bit. So I'm going to give you my most recent case study, and that Mark alluded to, and that is the Museum of Vancouver. I was hired and actually participated as a volunteer initially with the museum. I'm a total museum nerd, and the Museum of Vancouver was going through, as most museums in the world, was going through a really transformational moment. It was finding itself losing its audience, losing its relevance, drifting from really its purpose to kind of be a place where the city understood itself. And really at a certain point it was questioning its reason for existing. City museums are weird places because they're actually fairly rare, because their mandate really needs to be focused. But Vancouver had one. It has the most unbelievable collection of objects, but people weren't going. And so we started to think about what could be a role for a museum in a city like Vancouver that was at a point of transformation, that was thinking about itself in new ways. And really, one of the things that emerged was that there was this opportunity, a real opportunity for the museum to provide a place, a new platform for activity, for making, for thinking, for bringing people together in public spaces, a new third space to think about the city and what it could be. And that was it's a little bit nervous making for people who work in museums, who are very much about how they preserve, how they think about, how they make meaning is very much about how a curator takes an object and presents it to the public and what they do, as opposed to saying, let's open our doors and co-create meaning and think about what this city means. And so it's a real shift, and this is a slide from a really interesting museum thinker called Nina Simon, who is saying that there's this enormous shift, and this is happening in knowledge-based institutions everywhere, really driven by technology, cultural shifts. We are now makers of meaning, and so how does that impact traditional makers of meaning? If we want to go to a museum and we're making our own content, how can we interact in a more satisfying way? So going from this content provider to content platform provider, and that is a huge, that's like in organizations that are kind of hierarchical or vertical in their thinking, that is a huge shift. But it's a shift that's happening, and it's a train that's coming down the tracks, and so the institutions that are thinking this way are really ahead of the curve. And so the kind of projects that we took on, they weren't terribly avant-garde, I would say. They were getting people to think in creative ways, using objects, using ideas, using powerful speakers, getting them to think in creative ways about their city, but it was accessible. It was meant to be for everyone, and most importantly, a lot of these projects had outcomes. It was not to have a talk and then to see where things went. It was like, how could we bring the right people into the room who would hear an idea, a powerful idea, have a conversation with the public, and then take that idea forward? And I think that that's a huge piece. There was a lot of education and consciousness raising, and that continues. The museum is continuing to do this work. But this idea of bringing people in new ways to think about the city, and then what was the outcome in a cultural space. So this was an architectural speaker series that I did with Michael Green and my colleague Hannah Cho at the museum, where we said, architecture right now in the city there's so many interesting practitioners, but the public is not involved in that conversation. Architecture is very much its own discipline. And how can we broaden this? Because it's important to the quality of our lives in this city for people to understand architecture and participate, for everybody to. And so that idea that we needed to break out of this sort of, respectfully, a kind of professional insularity in architecture that's structured by the professional restrictions in architecture, and really get people excited and interested. And we made mistakes, we've made messes, we've taken chances, but this project, there were 3 parts. First was architectural karaoke, and I think there are a few people in the room here tonight who participated in that. So we took a page out of some interesting sort of stuff that the debaters do. We took 2 slides, 2 teams, we threw up architectural images, and we asked people with no preparation to either argue for or against them. It was really, and it was silly, it was interesting, it was messy, it was disrespectful, and so it kind of ripped the Band-Aid off the owie of this kind of, this way that we see architecture, and people who are non-practicing architects, maybe just architecture nerds. So it was an attempt to shift. There were some really interesting things, and I'll speak a little bit later about that, about moving through the city. So making free walking tours with architects, people who are thinking about the city, and getting people to walk through the city, think about transportation. We were trying to really take the ideas out into the city, use the city as the sort of basis for the conversation. And finally, again, asking people at a street level, everyday people, to confront, we started to pose questions about what people thought about the city, the planning, the architecture, and we put them in these weird little kiosks at corners in the downtown core. And people be asked to vote, and the votes in real time were projected into the museum. Now these were in some ways experiments, but they were meant, the goal was to start pushing this conversation about architecture into the street with people where they are, as opposed to asking people to come inside and participate only in these sort of very rarefied talks. We talked about homelessness, and the idea was that we would bring advocates, we would bring people who were really non-traditional, maybe people who are working in design, people who are working in communications, to think about it and And we started to talk about some of the solutions. We had Monty Paulson, who's a great former reporter with the Tyee, talking about the things that he'd observed in his research. So we said, what does this look like in our city? And we started to convene these conversations, and the outcomes of that, I think, Architecture for Humanity, and Linus Lam is here today, groups started to generate projects out of these conversations that came out of some of these opportunities to meet, to talk, and to discuss. Food security, we took a kitchen table, a group called the Downtown Eastside Neighborhood House, who was working on really interesting food, like the democracy around food in the city. Who has food, who doesn't? Where does food come from? And we put them at a kitchen table, and every weekend they would have a talk in the middle of a gallery talking about food. This was during a food exhibition. The outcomes of that are that people who would never have heard from food activists were hearing it. So we were trying to take social ideas, social change, and push them into this cultural realm. So, what did I learn from this? That the reason it worked, and the reason that people are coming back to the museum, the reason why it's a revived cultural institution, and I feel like I can say that with some confidence, is that it's this role changed from content maker and holder of knowledge to convener, to co-creator, to aggregator. Museums are very trusted, they're safe, they're cultural spaces, and people do trust them, we know from polling that they do. And so it became a non-aligned space to have some of these tough conversations about the city. It was about democratizing knowledge. It was about being vibrant and conversational. And there's this whole new thinking about why in social media do we gravitate towards the visual, towards the object? Why do we have these powerful conversations? There's a thinker called Yuri Engstrom who talks about object-based sociality. When you see an object, when you're in a museum, you see something powerful, it creates these really interesting conversations in the same way that a photo, that a powerful, pithy tweet, it becomes this focus. And so museums were using that power that they have to tell visual and narrative stories. So what does it look like? What is that? It was a socially engaged platform for the making of useful civic meaning. And I think that this is the challenge, that people in Vancouver, we have incredible assets. We have designers who are doing amazing avant-garde work. We have conveners who are doing great work, who are salons. A lot of the work, and I will say this respectfully, is about speaking to smaller communities. It's about your community of practice, your group. In many ways, this group is like that. We're all working in the same fields. We have a little bit of an echo chamber in social media right now. Maybe we think our reach is broader than it is because we're finding our tribes and we're bouncing off each other. I would like to challenge you to think about how to use creative practices, social practices, design practices, and to involve people in the city in making that change broadly. And I'm going to give you some examples of what that looks like. Does anybody have any questions? Is this making sense? It's oily. So, the Civic Lab. There's a couple of really interesting examples of this. I hope I'm not going to New York you out a bit, but there's some focus on New York here. So the BMW Guggenheim Lab. What we see here are two tenements in the Lower East Side, and there's this vacant lot. And so the Guggenheim has been thinking about this role of the museum in making meaning at a street level, at a public level, and convening conversations. And so really interesting project. It's part community center, part public space, part design lab, and it's a movable lab that was put into this vacant lot, and over 3 months, now this is going to be moved, this sort of movable exhibition, public exhibition, is going to go to Berlin now, and then to Mumbai, and it's become this intake, this laboratory for people to talk about social issues in a creative way in the city. So it's free. They had 100 events during this period. They had discussions about social housing, videos, technology, games. People walk off the street. There was no limitation to who could participate. I think if you were belligerent or you were endangering the safety of others, but it was as open space, and you can see from this it was designed as such. And the idea was that all this information, it was being sort of convened by a group of writers. Actually, there's a writer from Vancouver, Charles Montgomery, who's a nonfiction writer that some of you may know. They were driving some of these ideas. They were saying, what is it that makes a city comfortable? What does comfort mean in a city? And so they started to have these jams on a daily basis, and they're collecting all of this on a blog, and this lab will move around the world. It will be free in every place that it is. It will be provisional. It's a project that will take place over 9 years, and they're collecting this information in real time and reflecting it back to cities. I think this idea of the openness of it, that citizens can walk into this, these aren't new elements. Like, people have done this for the last 50 years in terms of urban development. I don't want to suggest that these are completely new forms, but they are ways to take creativity, to take deliberative democracy, openness, and technology and mesh them as ways to understand our cities differently. I don't see why Vancouver couldn't have something like this in some of the fallow spaces downtown that are owned by the City of Vancouver. Why groups or organizations couldn't take some time to create regular labs or lab spaces where this could happen. Another project was called the Festival of Ideas for a New City, and it was led by the New Museum, also in the Bowery. But it was really, again, a collaboration with architecture organizations, community organizations. It was a way, over 4 days in May, that a street festival, a city lab, projects that would take art making, creativity, design, architecture, community making, and get them to reflect on ideas for the city. And so they created these, they asked a design firm, they had a competition to design the new white tent, those hideous white tents where people, you go to the event, there's the white tent. Well, they created these worm spaces that you can see in front of the museum here, where people, over 4 days, 100 sort of street-level cultural organizations started to talk about what their projects were in the city. There was projection. There was an element of making what was happening in the city visible outside of these spaces and on the street. This is my favorite project. It's called the Laundromat Project, and it's an organization that works with low-income, predominantly people of color in New York, and it takes art projects to laundromats. And so there's creative, that goes to where people are making meaning. I'll give you, and then we had kids involved in this. So this is a really interesting, this lab, this idea of how do you involve as many people in this conversation, take those ideas and move them forward. This is the place here where I'm really interested, and I think this is an interesting moment. Taking transparency, open source convening, and creative conversations and creating new models. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the group Mass LBP that works out of Toronto. They are a kind of an organization that is looking at re-engineering public consultation. And they do this by looking at the model of a civic lottery. The civic lottery was kind of pioneered by groups working in Vancouver around the Citizens Assembly that was rethinking our democratic process a few years ago. And it's companies, it's cities, it's governments, and instead of doing a consultation where you invite people to come, where often what you get is a culture of complaint, of anger, of people have pent up, it becomes a safety valve, you do a lottery. You do a random call, 10,000 people in a particular area that you're focusing on. They're getting 7% return, and they're inviting people to participate in a lottery where they will start making cities. So they do residence panels in Toronto, the city of Halton. These groups are basically randomly selected. They win in a lottery, and they get to help make policy. They get to participate in making their cities, transforming their cities. They have a role, they have a seat at the table, but they're not handpicked. They are literally selected randomly. So how does that work with in the creative field? There's a really interesting group called Diaspora Dialogues in Toronto, And they are a group of writers who are really trying to reflect their writers, their poets, and they're working on to really reflect the diversity of writers in the city, and they're trying to understand their city through writing. So Diaspora Dialogues came together with a randomly selected group by Mass LBP that reflected all the wards in the city, and over this last fall, they started to do these dialogues where we had citizens at large combined with writers who were thinking about the city, and they came together to start reflecting on their city, thinking about the future, thinking what were the forgotten stories. And these ideas, these musings are fed, they're open to the public, but then they're fed into the city, they're fed back to the city governments. There's a channel. And so it's taking this artistic practice, these artists, these creatives, it's taking these sort of democratic models and fusing them. And I think that very quality, that crossover, that hybrid is really interesting, and I think that's the new sweet spot. That is the new place where it's reaching, building your community, your artistic, creative community, and then taking it to the broader public. There is a field that gets a little bit into, I may not focus too much on this, but the idea of public interest design, which is really where design meets sort of service and public good, but I think in the interests of moving ahead, I'm going to sort of blast ahead here. I think another thing is popularizing design education. I think this is a huge challenge to any of you. I think that we see that there is a low level of understanding and opportunity to learn about design for kids, for people in all neighborhoods, and there are opportunities to open up this conversation through learning, through popular education, through urban pedagogy, which is about taking, which we tried to do a little bit of this at the museum, where you take the learning out into the street and make it free. This is an image of Humanities 101, which is UBC's basically open university for low-income residents in the downtown east side. Why couldn't you do, this is a friend of mine, Todd Falkowski, who in Toronto does a design camp for kids in elementary schools. Could we have a civics camp, a design camp, open learning about design education that would provide a new platform and a new opportunity? I think that there's programs at Arts Umbrella, there's a few things that are happening right now, but how to democratize that learning, because I think that knowledge is really important, and it's a missing piece. I want to just do, how am I doing on the time here? Am I getting there? Yeah, wrap it up. Broken City Lab. Are any of you familiar with this group in Windsor? This is a group of artists who are committed to transforming what they see as a dying city. Windsor is a city that is basically, as a result of economic change, manufacturing issues, it's a dying city, twinned with Detroit. And so Broken City Lab are a group of young artists who are really trying to reflect on their city and to open up these conversations through their artistic practices about making the city a better place. This is unbelievable. These guys were invited to take part in a typical city consultation. It was so distressing to them that they needed a group counseling session. So they decided that their next activity would be to gather outside of City Hall, take some of their projection technology, and then reflect the meeting they wish they'd had on the actual building. And they made a really powerful list of things they wished that happened in that meeting, and things that they wanted and they saw, and they submitted it. But they also said, here's an interesting thing. We're going to say, that was really dissatisfying. That was really not creative. It was not consultative. It was not a process that worked for us. There's a bit of the resistance, but there's also, how are they going to take those ideas and move on? They also have a, oops, let me go back here. They had a really interesting project where they asked residents to register with buttons sites of apology or hope in their cities. So they gave people buttons, and they would walk through the city and say, okay, what site, what vacant lot do you think do we need to sort of preserve, to keep as a site of hope, as a site that needs to be restored, and where do we need to just like raise the ground here? And so people started to participate in these active opportunities. And as I understand it, the city government is really listening and really is starting to build this very interesting relationship with this group. And then there are the micro interventions. There's the art projects like this actually in New York called where you take basically a community group and you ask them to take a yellow arrow and say what they wish they wanted in that space. So insert park here. There are some unbelievable projects happening in Vancouver, and in some ways I'm hesitant to name them all for fear of not naming everyone and leaving anyone out. But these sort of urban interventions, these insertions into the actual space of the city are happening, and I think this is a really interesting place. And these micro interventions, they build up. They start to have a transformative impact. This was Other Sites, which is a great public art organization, and this was a digital natives project where they took some of the digital billboards over the Burrard Bridge and they started to respond in tweets, and this was online, offline signage started to reflect on Aboriginal presence and dislocation in the city. I like this one. This is actually broken in Civic Lab. So they just take these big letters and they'll just place them in very prominent areas that just suck. So I'm talking a good game here. So what am I going to do? There's the T-shirt, but there's more than that. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to talk to you about this. This is a bike car that I saw at a really interesting little event at Bumbershoot in Seattle this year. And these guys are bike nerds. We have a lot of bike nerds here. These guys take used parts, discarded parts, and they teach you and they build bike cars, which are bikes that can handle 5 or 6 passengers. So you get the bike, you make the bike, and then you can tote stuff around. There are ones that are designed for storage, designed for transport, and there's ones that are designed for kids. And my children attend the local school where I live, and we often have kind of a walking school bus, which I actually hate. I know people romanticize that, all the children walk along. It drives me nuts. I cannot stand it. But imagine a bike car. You know, we can stop, I strap them in. They can't go anywhere. We get on our cool looking car, we put our backpacks in these plastic drums, and we go, and we get there, and we're modeling some artistic practice, we're modeling sustainability, we're modeling community, we're telling a story through that intervention. So we'll see if that happens. So I do think that convening is the killer app. I think creating new platforms, I think inserting yourself in a way that really expands your communities of practice, your creative work, to not only the communities where you're most comfortable and most fed, let's be honest, the people that you know that feed you creatively, that you bounce ideas off of, that is such an important part of this. But how can you take what you do to a broader group and engineer it in such a way that there are outcomes that are going to transform your city? What I'm articulating are some progressive ideas and values that I hold and things that I see, but what is your project? What is your reflection? I want to challenge people to move beyond the generative, creating new projects, creating maybe even avant-garde projects, or creating insular projects and pushing them out, thinking about how you connect with people in a broad way, how you re-engage them in democracy by participating, and maybe use some of the technologies from other fields to kind of move this ahead. I think that we have an opportunity. This last quote is by David Isaacs, who is a sort of master convener, identified this idea called World Cafe. I won't get into it, but the idea that community building requires a concept of leaders one who creates experience for others, experiences that in themselves are examples of our desired future. Who better but the people in this room to do that? So, this is my challenge to you. You don't only live here. You're not a tourist in the city, despite how much you may feel like it when you're riding your bike along the seawall. But this city needs these kind of interventions. It needs this innovation. It needs your ability to prototype, your ability to do studios, to do labs, to do iterative work, to think outside of the box, to shock people, to communicate directly with people. It needs that. It doesn't need more consultative practices. The city has its hands full. They need to get elected every 3 years, and they need to drive solutions within that. They have short mandates. What are we going to do do citizen-led, creative-led projects that are transformative? So that's where I'm going to leave it.
So does anybody have any really good questions in their head that they want to ask Amanda? I know you do. Who's going to do the brave first?
Oh.
Okay, I'll ask one. Amanda. Oh, there's one. Hello.
Melissa Murray.
Hi, Melissa.
That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, once you have an idea, if I bring people together and talk about the city, where do you start?
It's a great question. There's a lot of the partners in these really interesting projects are grantors, and there's some really interesting micro grants that are happening in the city. The Vancouver Foundation has neighborhood level grants. They're little grants, but they're enough to kind of get some stuff started. That you can approach the city about using public space. You could also do it guerrilla style. But I think a lot of it is about kind of finding that you got to be wily. Like, you've got to find the partners, you got to find the spaces, you've got to find maybe a space partner. I mean, this is W2, again, another model of convening is the ultimate platform for these things. So that's, I think, in some ways finding that piece. But I think that it's sort of this idea of the potluck too. Like, how are we going to, what can people contribute or put together? But I think these neighborhood grants are really interesting. They're a good way to seed some of these projects. Has anyone heard of the Awesome Foundation too? They don't have a chapter here yet, but I think we need to start one. So there's another challenge. I'm full of ideas for other people today. That's great. I would really want to apologize for I do a lot of public speaking, and I insist that people leave room for conversation, and I really sincerely want to apologize to you guys for that, because that's where a lot of the cool stuff happens. So I am a site of apology here.
Don't worry about it, we're talking now.
Okay.
See another.
And I'm still talking. Ariane.
So kind of like a loaded question. I know over the past couple years, a lot of things have moved to the free model of economy, of apps, a lot of people work for free, a lot of people collaborate. There's never a source of income. Through your talk, which has been really inspirational, right? I'm just wondering how you see our community, other communities further down the line, kind of living. Like everybody else, Vancouver's ridiculously expensive for renters, for homeowners. How do you have any perspective on how in maybe the next 10 years you see the cities like this with a ton of creativity changing and working within a model where there's very little money or very little money talked about in the process? Yeah.
I mean, there's one thing that comes to mind, and that is I didn't get a chance to talk about what businesses are doing, because I think that there are some, what I'm seeing is that companies, I'm not talking about sole proprietors or independent small business owners, but larger companies are really the ones that are going to thrive, I think, into the sort of the coming decades, are the ones that are creating value in their communities as well as value for their company. And so there's a couple of models that totally key on what I'm talking about here. I don't know, Bing Tom. Bing Tom Architects have created a whole public sort of wing that does community-driven research, open source research, and makes it available to people. And that, I think, there is a lost leader aspect to that too. Like, you're creating knowledge, you're creating value, and then I think that does in turn bring people in. But I think this is a key piece. I think how do you sort of live this kind of transformational life where you're creating value, where you're doing this work and still make a living? I think it's I think it's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I do think that there's not enough collaboration, and I see this in Vancouver. I see a lot of generative, lots of creativity, lots of individual projects that don't take into account existing projects, resources, and platforms, because everybody's excited about the new here, and we're not looking at what the platforms are that exist already that we can piggyback on. I mean, sometimes those platforms are too, it's not open enough, but I think that's an important thing to look at too, is collaborating. Hope that was, yeah, yes.
What mechanisms are there to ensure that you get public engagement in these kinds of projects?
Hold on.
Hey, I'm Craig. I was
Hi.
just wondering what mechanisms do you use to ensure that you get public engagement for these kinds of projects?
I think that's a really good question. I think that, there's very tactical things, and then there's things in the actual development of the project. So if your goal right at the outset is if you say, my goal is to make sure that this group gets funding to get their project done or get their ideas out there, that's how you design the project. But I also think things about making it free, making it open-ended enough that people don't feel nervous walking into it. I think that there's all sorts of stuff around, Amanda Fenton, who isn't, I don't know if she's here today, there's stuff around the art of hosting where you can make spaces more inviting, more open to people who, from a range of backgrounds, and that it's about making people feel comfortable to walk into this space. I think that it's really, here I am preaching this, it's got to be two-way. And you have to articulate the benefit to both parties. It has to be so clear what is in it for me and what is in it for you. And I think I think at the outset, so for instance, if you're doing a project and you're getting all these ideas out, but you're not connecting people with funders or policymakers, like it's you're pissing in the wind. Like it's just going out there. So how do you collate? How do you gather that information, and how do you ensure that it's not just one more conversation? Yeah, yeah.
Hi, Amanda. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
My question is, you mentioned something in passing, which was object-based sociality.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me the name of that person again, Yuri?
Yeah, Yuri Engstrom, and he's really a social media guru guy who's really started to think about. He comes from sociology, and he's thinking about why Facebook works, why Flickr works, why these tools are kind of becoming part of our understanding of the world. And the idea is that the social object becomes that, sometimes when you're having a conversation, the conversation is animated when there's that third thing that everybody's focusing on. It gives you a point of contact. And so that's why museums, why cultural institutions, galleries, they kind of have a way of participating. That's what makes them vibrant. I don't know if you've ever been to a gallery with a friend where you're looking at a piece of art and it sparks a really interesting conversation, but it also it creates an atmosphere for conversation as well. So that social object can be a story, it can be a streetscape, it can be a problem, it can, those signs that insert themselves into the city, those are social objects. So it's very likely you'll stop and you'll use that as a point of conversation. Yeah, the name tags are absolutely that, yeah.
We probably have time for one more really good question. Who's feeling like they have the killer?
It's not really a killer question. Come on.
What do you think happened to Vancouver after the Stanley Cup riots in terms of participation, collaboration, people coming together, both from a city perspective and us as a society?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that that was a really interesting moment, and I don't want to overdetermine what that was, but I think that was a pretty good indicator that there's a lack of social cohesion. If there's anything that's an indication, that would be it. I think that response was really interesting, but I think that response was about shame, and it was about a public shaming and people feeling very. I think it was an indication of civic pride and community, but I think those kind of responses need to go beyond that. Like, I think it was heartening to see that, but it's what's happening now, and what are the longer term ways that we can sort of create those positive, those appreciative, those ways to create sites of hope in our city and focuses of hope. A lot of this has to do with issues of public space, where people gather. You know, I haven't focused on all of these issues that are key to sort of civics, but I think, where do cities gather, and where do they have sacred spaces, ritual, celebration? Those spaces are not clear here. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to say, how are we going to gather? Of course we want to gather. There's clearly an appetite for it. But what is this? Where are those spaces that make that possible?
Well said. Thank you very much.